Hey everyone, this is Jaime Alejandro with the Arts Calling podcast, the place where I interview hard-working independent creatives in the literary, visual, and performing arts. Now here goes. Today I am delighted to be Arts Calling poet Kim Dower. Kim Dower, the City Poet Laureate of West Hollywood from 2016 to 2018, has published 5 highly acclaimed collections of poetry, all from Red Hen Press. Her most recent book, the bestselling I Wore This Dress Today for You, Mom, an Eric Hoffer Book Award finalist, was called A Fantastic Collection by the Washington Post, impressively insightful, thought-provoking, and truly memorable by the Midwest Book Review, and Shelf Awareness said, these gorgeous gems are energized by the sheer power of her wit and irreverent style. Kim's work has been featured in numerous literary journals including Plume, Plowshares, Rattle, the James Dickey Review, and Garrison Keillor's The Writer's Almanac. And her poems are included in several anthologies, notably Wide Awake, Poets of Los Angeles and Beyond. She teaches poetry workshops for Antioch University, UCLA Extension Writers Program, and the West Hollywood Library. Born and raised on the Upper West Side of New York City and a graduate of Emerson College in Boston, Kim is also the proud owner of Kim from LA, a long-standing literary publicity company that helps authors around the country get the word out about their wonderful books. So there you have it, folks. We have a tremendous guest in store, and to be honest, I could not ask for a better guest to start us off in 2025. Kim is incredibly generous here about crafting poetry, marketing, and the creative life. And personally, I am deeply grateful she took the time to share her insights with me, especially given that I had a rough couple of months at the end of 2024. This conversation really lifted me up and set me on the right path once again. So I'd like to give thanks to Kim and her team for being awesome, for their patience, and I thank you, dear listener, for coming along as we get Arts Calling 2025 underway. Now, without further delay, let's give Kim a call. Good morning, Kim. How are you?
Hey, I'm doing well. Thank you so much for inviting me on your show. I really appreciate it.
Yes, it's going to be such a wonderful time. But of course, I'm really excited to get to talk to you about your new collection, which is coming out, which is What She Wants. But maybe we could create a little bit more context about who you are as a human being, because you seem to have a whole bunch of stories. And so I'd like to sort of get to know you a little bit more that way. If we could sort of trace ourselves back to the beginning here. You're from the East Coast, is that right?
I am. I grew up in New York City, right there in the city, 89th Street off Broadway. So, right there.
So as a small town person, I'm always struck by people who just grew up around the, it's such a cliche thing to say, hustle and bustle, and crazy busyness. Yeah. But what was that experience like? What do you remember about growing up in those kinds of situations in that world?
Oh my, because it's the only thing I know. I didn't know it was unusual. I didn't know it was almost crazy. I didn't know it was dangerous. I didn't know anything because you're a kid and that's where you are. So for me, it was my life. I knew, however, probably by junior high school that it was special, that it was unique, because I started visiting friends I'd met in camp who lived in the suburbs, in New Jersey or Connecticut, and they lived in houses and they rode their bikes on little streets and they they could go out after dark. So I got a feeling, oh, wow, this is unusual where you are. I grew up right in the city in an apartment building with 12 floors. Probably when I was 10, I counted once, there were, maybe 50 or 60 kids my age in that building. Wow. Everyone was a family, and you'd get in the elevator, going to school. I lived on the 6th floor. The elevator would stop on the 6th floor. There would be like 20 people in the elevator already. So I loved it. I loved growing up in the city. I felt really excited. about doing all the things you can do there, going to
Right.
museums, going to the park,
Yeah. So, did you start making any observations? Because I know that a lot of poets and creative people, when they're younger, they start sort of looking at the world or maybe realizing that maybe I see things a lot more differently than other people. Did you ever have those kinds of feelings like, I'm observing something and I need to document it or I need to share it? Is there something that you can remember doing at an early age that could lead you to poetry or to writing in general?
Yeah, absolutely. I used to talk to my dolls, those poor creatures in my room on all the shelves. I had many, many, many dolls, and I forced them to listen to my poems, and I would write little things. And I was very much my own world. I really was. I had a busy family. I had an older brother who had his own life, and I kind of retreated into my room and made up stories. I remember the first little story I ever wrote. I was in the fourth grade, and it was about flying saucers. And I'm not, I don't care about sci-fi or anything, but I just thought the word saucer was interesting, that they called them flying saucers. So I created the first time they were flying saucers where someone was mad and he started throwing saucers out of his window from the sixth floor, and they were flying saucers. Well, okay, fabulous. There you have it. But I took out my aggression,
Right.
writing these little stories.
That's such a curious, like, little kernel of observation that maybe a lot of kids are just not sort of on the same frequency. But I remember having countless of those types of explorations and interactions with the world where I would misunderstand maybe, but then it would become something completely different. And I think that's almost a core thing in poetry too, right? Where like you see something, but
Yeah.
then there's just a completely different side of it. So as you're sort of studying this, did you go to school for this? Did you have a passion for creative writing early on that you said, I'm going to go to school for this? Or was it a discovery that you made later on that you felt like you needed to go this route?
Well, I think it was a little of both. It was a happy accident because I was writing. I was on the school newspaper. I went to public high school in New York and George Washington High School, and I was a member of the Cherry Tree, which was the newspaper. And I wrote my first story called "Maxi Coats Are Sweeping the Hallways." I mean, the fact that I remember this is really almost tragic.
Yeah,
But
you got to tell me.
anyway, I remember. So I was always writing. I was always, when I teach, I say as poets, we really are journalists. We have to report what we see in a different way, in a way it's never been reported before. So, if we're writing about a tree, we're reporting about that tree, and we have to report about it in a way that you've never heard about that. So anyway, I think that seed was planted. And of course, I always say that a good poem is about one thing, but then it's about the other thing. And I think that's what you're just hitting on here.
Yeah, yeah.
What's underneath the thing, we're writing about. It's what we see, but it's also the other thing that's there as well. So I went to a college. I had no idea it was going to change my life about poetry. I wanted to get out of New York, the city that I
Mm,
grew up in, but it was also too much for me. I wanted to go to a smaller city, not the country, but a smaller city. And so I went to Emerson College in Boston before it was a big deal, which I guess it is now. It was a little school. You didn't need to be smart to get in. You didn't need good SAT scores. You just needed your parents to write the check and get to Boston. And basically, that was the story. But the happy surprise, well, more than a happy surprise, it was, I, I thank goodness every day for it. It had an incredible creative writing program, and it was run by an incredible man named Dr. James Randall, and he hired really, really good poets. And the first poet I ever had, the teacher, was Thomas Lux, who later became, one of our great poets. He's no longer with us, so sadly, but he was my first teacher. And in that class, the world opened up for me. That I never was the same again.
I know it's difficult to generalize, but maybe we can get to the specifics here of something like, do you recall works of poetry that transcended at that time that you felt maybe clarified some things for you about what poetry is or what it should be? Because I feel at that moment it's such an explosion of information that you could get lost in the number of things that you're experiencing intellectually, academically, I'm sure. But do you recall certain poems or pieces of craft that were imparted to you that you felt like, wow, the light bulb went on. I actually understand what this is. Like, if you can recall, I know it
Well,
it can be difficult to narrow down.
yeah, it was a big combination of things. There wasn't just one poem that it was a combination of Tom Lux's incredible passion for poetry, watching him read poems that I didn't really understand. I wasn't there yet, but he loved them so much and listening to him read them. So he was at that point very much into the surrealists,
Okay.
which has sort of gone out of favor a little. You don't hear that much about them. But back then, it was James Tate, Bill Knott, these poets who I began to adore, and listening to them was really important. But on my own time, this was not taught in school, but on my own time, I was given a gift by a friend of Erica Jong's poetry, Fruits and Vegetables. And, many people don't know this, but before Fear of Flying, before she became a huge, mega best-selling author of Fear of Flying, she was a poet and remained a poet her whole life. And Fruits and Vegetables was something she wrote before she wrote Fear of Flying. So it's a beautiful book, which I still have. And it was just all poems about fruits and vegetables. But it was also about everything else. It was about lust and sex and love and life and desire. And it really, really moved me to my core. So I'm learning about these male surrealist poets in college in a very macho world at that time. Women
Mm,
poets were not really taught that much.
yeah.
Of course, Anne Sexton was across the road teaching at BU, but then she sadly, left this world. So it was a combination of the gorgeousness of Erica Jong's poems, the surreal poems, Bill Knott, James Tate, and then I was introduced by another teacher that year who remains my favorite poet, Frank O'Hara.
Mm,
And Frank O'Hara, the New York School of Poetry, would say a good poem is like a good phone call. Both people have to have a good time and you're just, sharing information. So he wrote in the New York School, which really spoke to me. And he wrote the poem, The Day Lady Died, about Billie Holiday. And he sees that headline on the front page of the Post, the New York Post. And then the greatest of the great, William Carlos Williams.
mhm.
And I'll just say that his poem, which we all learned in school, so much depends upon a red wheelbarrow glazed with rainwater by the white chickens. So what does that mean? And I remember the teacher was, what does that mean? What does that mean? And I was so scared I couldn't talk in class. And the answer is, what it means is your ability to see that wheelbarrow glazed with rainwater by the white chickens, where you might drive down that road and not notice it, but to
Mhm.
notice it and notice all about it is what poetry is.
That has to be one of the best poems to actually illustrate to people like how beautiful and impactful it is to distill to its bare essence, like the most insanely pristine essence of what it is to write a poem. I I remember, like, much in your situation, I didn't understand it. I didn't get it. I didn't know. But, it did take some time for me to say, "Oh, wow, I just need to take a step back and accept it for what it is, and there's such beauty in there." But, it reminds me, as you were saying just a moment ago, of, the type of work that encompasses so much, even though it might just be about one thing. I was listening to some of your poetry readings on YouTube, and one of the TED poetry sessions came up, and one of the ones that really struck me was sardines. And we might be bouncing back and forth, and I think it sort of fills that kind of void. It sort of fills that space of a poem that is about this very tradition, very regular act, right? Like, it's not something that is extraneous. It's a simple thing that we all do. We're consuming sardines, we're eating. But yet in that little space of time, you managed to give us the world. You managed to give us that experience. And that seems to be, though, the way that you sort of unravel the simple, or maybe take the cosmic, the large, the amazing, and then you distill it into something that's very specific and very very intimate. So maybe we can get rolling on the actual publications, because I think that you've refined this quite a bit as you continue to roll along. So when does that sensibility make sense to you? When do you start feeling like these elements are now coming together, these different schools, these things that I appreciate? I mean, it's difficult to get a sense of that while you're in the middle of it, but do you feel like that's something that happened fairly clearly to you? That these things were solidifying into your own voice?
Oh, wow. What a great question. I don't know how it happened. I know that, every teacher says the same thing: read, 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 read. I mean, every teacher says that from second grade on through college. So I did try, and I do try to read a lot of poetry. I am grateful to those early teachers, for William Carlos Williams, for all the surrealists, for really opening my mind up to all these different poets. I think that developing one's voice is the hardest thing about this craft. Um, and I do think I have a voice. I mean, people will say to me, "Oh, that's a real Kim poem." And at first I'm thinking, well, what does that mean? But I get what it means. This book, what she wants, is not all very much in that voice. I did try to move away from it, although I have to admit some of my favorite poems in the book are more in the Kim voice, which is, as you say, as you put really well, just kind of going through, starting with one thing, and then you're on a journey, and suddenly you're in my room as a teenager, or you're at the beach, or you're talking to my mother, and wait a minute, we were with the sardines a minute ago. I do that. My poems are very narrative. They tell a story. In this book, more are lyric, where it's about a moment or a feeling rather than a story. But I think a lot of my poems combine lyric with narrative. But I want to say that I had my own voice from the beginning. But reading all these people and honing the craft and going to workshops, so many workshops, and hearing what people thought of my work, helping develop, made the voice I started with much stronger.
Yeah. And I'm glad you mentioned it, because I have two things now. I'm glad you introduced the book, because maybe you can get into it. But maybe the framing of the question should be more like, how are you stripping away all of these influences to find yourself again? Because maybe that is what some poets need to do, rather than try to build this new sort of cluster of perspective. You're sort of stripping away all of the stuff that is really influencing you. But it seems that you're very clear on what your voice has been for a while. And I've actually, I appreciate sort of the quality of that voice, which is narrative, which is very approachable, and also, lyrical, of course. But how to decide what to tackle in this new poetry collection that is different? I think that you've reached a point where you said, I've done too much of that, enough of that. Or is it an organic thing that you're just stripping away an old layer of the self, right?
Yeah, I think that's true. I think that I decided to take a chance. Look, I have a publisher, Red Hen publisher, and they value me, which is really exceptional. And I value them. And I think that they were like, great, we'll take this. I mean, you know, they were like, we like these poems. Now I have to believe they're good. You know, you're really, it is a different voice. A lot of them are shorter. They are lyric. They're a moment. And then I do have the longer ones, which go on.
To Get Into What She Wants, which, by the way, a great title and a great illustration, a great image here. That is one of my favorites from Dali. Maybe we can start this way. Can you share something that clued you in, like a poem that you worked on from that collection that clued you in on what it was going to be? Because I think that there are mile marker, pieces in a collection that might point the way.
I can tell you very, very exactly. And it wasn't a poem, but let me tell you. I came across a word. I always think of pre-pandemic. This was before COVID, so we're talking like 6 or 7 years ago. I read a word called limerence. 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 I had never seen that word before. And the word is a state of being where you're obsessively infatuated with someone, usually accompanied by delusion or a desire for an intense romantic relationship with that person. And it may not at all be reciprocated, but we've all felt it, I think, unless I'm, just a total psycho, but it's like, you decide that person's like really into you, and then you read all these things into it, like, oh, the way he looked at me, or he said this, or he said that, and you create this whole, and it is a psychological state that has 4 stages. Okay, so I became obsessed with the word limerence, and I thought, this is amazing. And then, furthermore, there's the 4 stages. So listen to this. The 4 stages of limerence are infatuation, crystallization, that's where it starts to come together. Deterioration, we all know that part. And then in this limerence, the 4th stage is ecstatic release, where the person can finally let go of the whole thing and move on. Well, I just thought this is too great to pass up. So I started to put a collection together based on limerence and the 4 stages of limerence. Now, there's about 30 poems from previous books that just had to go in these categories. And then the rest are new poems. It's a pretty full book, but that's the story. And I will tell you that when I went to my publisher, it was Limerence was the title. And they said, look, no one's going to know what Limerence is. So we're going to have this great book that's no one's going to know what the title is. So I'm like, yeah, you're right. Okay, got it. So it's called What She Wants, Poems on Obsession, Desire, Despair, Euphoria. But guess what? There's been all these articles about limerence in the last year. And I'm thinking, wow, I could have been like ahead of the curve on this, but here we are. That is the story. So what was the most fun for me with this collection was putting the poems in the different categories and then writing new ones like for ecstatic release and just having guidelines, which was very helpful.
Yeah. That's fascinating because I feel like maybe, I don't know if this is what happens, where you have an overarching structure that sort of fills that narrative need that one might have. Do you feel like it liberates the poem as a unit of expression to be less formatted, to be less rigid in a way?
You mean the shorter narrative ones?
Yeah.
Look, it's not my comfort zone. Okay. I like to chat. I like to tell a lot. I like that sardines poem that you mentioned. That's one of my favorite poems because it really ramps up these two friends are eating sardines, and then they start talking about one doesn't like them, one does, and why. And then they talk about their little boys losing them at a hotel, and there's a lot going on there. And I like to write that kind of a poem. So they're more delicate, and I'm like not sure. Wow, is this really doing its job?
Yeah.
But I'm letting it go.
Okay.
I'm going to be okay with it.
Right. But I think that's the mark of something that it was a proper challenge for you then, where you say, I'm not 100% on this. I feel like this is really pushing me to the limit. So that must have been a delight to see sort of come to pass, because it's on the way out, right? It is on the verge of publication here soon.
It's on the way out, and it's okay. I'm okay with it. I'm excited for it, actually.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you feel that in the context of your personal life, how does this sort of stack up in terms of the outside elements coming in and influencing what you initially had in mind? Because obviously one begins with an idea, with a thematic direction, but then, life starts imbuing other things. Did you have massive changes to the direction of this collection that you didn't expect?
No, I mean, the work is very separate from, well, in a lot of ways, of course, it's not separate from your life. I mean, you are, however the words come through you. Anne Simpson used to say that God speaks her poems to her. That she would sit there and she didn't know where they came from. Now, I'm not going to go that far, but there are lines and poems and ideas that I don't know where they come from. If there's a God up there who's sending them to me, hey, keep them coming. That's all I can say. I don't know. But no, I just did my thing. This book was handed in like 4 years ago.
Oh, wow.
Okay. It just takes a long time.
Yeah.
A long time. So but I will say that I got it together. I gave it to them. Then you get it back, you copy it, you make some changes. It wasn't until I got the galley, which is this, which I wish you
beautiful.
had. It wasn't until I had this that I was like afraid. I was like this, like, oh my God. What? What's that going to be like? But there you go.
No, absolutely. And you mentioned something here. You do your thing. What is your practice, right? Your daily practice look like, and has it evolved from the previous collections that you've put together? Is that something that you've just kind of settled in? You say, this is business. I'm just gonna do my thing. And what does that look like?
Well, for this book, it was just work. You see, I don't have a practice, that I hold myself to every day, because to me, that I think if you're writing a novel, you have to sit down every day and you got to get back into that. And people have all kinds of tricks to do that. They stop the night before at a cliffhanger so that in the morning they can race back to it, which I think is great, which if I ever wrote a novel, that's probably what I would do. Like, can't wait to get back to that part. Some people are just stuck, but everyone is like butt in the chair every day. That's what you have to do. It's tedious. We talk about the difference between poetry and prose is like hiking and poetry is like dancing, and so for poetry, I say, we're open for business here, Ms. Muse. We are waiting for you. And, the muse can come because the muse is a lot of baloney too. But I find, every single thing throughout the day is a possible prompt, is a possible inspiration, which I don't like that word either, but it's a possible start of a poem. How's that? So I hear the first poem in What She Wants is, the first poem is called She'll Do Anything for Food. And I went out for a walk, as I do every day, from my desk, for my day job. And there was a woman walking her dog. And the dog like jumped up at me, and the woman said she'll do anything for food. And I thought, oh God, well, that doesn't sound so good. But I thought, thank you. You've just given me the line for a poem. And then we got into a conversation, and I came upstairs back to my office, to my computer, and I wrote the poem. And I can read it if you want.
I'd be delighted if you could. That would be an absolute pleasure.
All right. So oftentimes my titles are the first sentence of the poem, the first line of the poem. So in this case, it is. So the first poem in the book, and we were talking about how do I write what I write in the process. A lot of times I just listen to conversations. I steal lines that I hear. They're really great prompts for me because what people say is just amazing sometimes, and it gets me going. So I've written poems in the parking lot of Target after I just, left and bought something and heard something. I've written them from headlines from the newspaper. So this particular poem is called "She'll Do Anything for Food." She'll do anything for food, the dog walker tells me. She speaks quietly, not wanting to insult her heavy-boned, one blue, one brown-eyed beast tugging at her leash. We did a doggy ancestor test, she confides. Discovered she's part wolf, part miniature poodle. Must be the poodle part, makes her so ravenous. Small creatures are ruthless feeders. Think of enraptured rats gnawing their way through orange trees. Babies nursing, sucking so fiercely they can burst a nipple. Think of your heart, size of a throbbing fist, the part of you that will do anything for love.
Wonderful. I love this idea of us zeroing in on the great commonality, but you begin with just such a throwaway moment. It could be, but now you just dig deeper and deeper and deeper. So can we talk for a minute about how you shape that type of poem and what kind of work goes into shaping something like this so that you can sort of pack that moment right at the very end and into such an emotional and human sort of piece?
Honest to God, I don't know.
That's my favorite answer too, because you say it's like, this is an intuitive thing and you're going and finding, and it's sort of like digging through, I imagine, and finding that. I'm less of a poet and more of a playwright. So I think of this stuff in terms of character. It's like you're getting into this particular character, but then you find out that character is all of us in some way. But thank you so much for giving us that reading.
You're so welcome. I mean, I start with what really happened, that line, and then the dog, the doggy, the fact that the dog is part wolf, part miniature poodle. I mean, that's irresistible. If you can't make that work, you become an accountant. Do you know what I'm saying? Yeah. I mean, that is material given to you on a silver platter. But I'll tell you that it's always, for me, great, great, great pleasure writing these poems. I mean, the hardest thing and the most important thing is the opening and the closing. Getting into that poem so people want to get in with you, and then having a really intense ending. And that's very hard. And I'll sit sometimes for an hour with my eyes closed and it doesn't come. And I'll leave it alone for a week, and then it'll come back. I mean, I have on my computer, I have different folders: poems in progress, poems in play. I don't even know what the difference. I look in the two folders. Why did I call it that? Because poems not published, poems in progress, poems in play, new poems in progress. They're all in there, and there's a lot of them, and they're at different stages. And so, if something doesn't hit me, like a conversation like that, or a headline in the newspaper, like once I listened to news talk, which I won't be listening to anymore. I can assure you.
I'm right there with you.
That's my sales. But when I used to listen to the news, there was once this story called "They're Taking Chocolate Milk Off the Menu" in public schools. And I thought, thank you for that. You know, they're taking chocolate milk off the menu. What's next? And then you just go into, automatic writing. What else are they doing to our children? But so it's very fun. I lost my train of thought, but I just want to say that I enjoy the process. Now, if nothing's come to me during the day or for a couple of days, and I'm feeling that incomplete feeling that I feel if I haven't written a line or two, I'll go to my folders, poems in progress, poems in play, poems. And I'll say, oh, that one, I'd like to go back. I forgot about that one. And then, then I can finish it up.
Yeah. I know this might be difficult, but could you recall a poem, or maybe perhaps we could do a reading of a poem that was one of those long gestating, sort of simmering pieces that you just kept coming back to and couldn't find a way in, and eventually made its way, made the short list, if you will, to the publication? Do you have anything like that in this one?
In this book?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a longer, more narrative one. Sometimes the short ones you can't get out of. You can't.
Right.
It's like, this is short, and what is this supposed to be doing? But so I had actually one of my teachers at Emerson College was a great poet. Of course, I can't find the poem in here. A great poet named William Matthews, and he also passed away, sadly. But William Matthews was just a wonderful poet. For your listeners, look him up. He's great. And I'm just flipping through this. So I read a poem that he wrote called Promiscuous. And I thought, and he wrote about it in the way he wanted to write about it, obviously. But it, to me, was a prompt. See, I also love poems by the same title and reading them. So a wonderful poet, Elena Karina Byrne, and we just did this show called Poetry LA. We recorded it on Saturday. And we both read a poem that we'd written called Longing. And her poem Longing and my poem Longing are so different. But it's about the same feeling of longing. If you wrote a poem about longing, it would also be so different. But the feeling is real. The way you talk about it is different, right?
Yeah.
Anyway, this is about a 2-minute poem. Are we okay with that?
That's just fine. That's delightful.
All right. So I thought, okay, Bill Matthews, I'm going to write this for you. This is my version of Promiscuous. And this poem took me very long to write. I kept coming back to it. Promiscuous. Promiscuous is what my mother called a friend of mine in high school. It wasn't just the word, but the way she said it, savoring every syllable as if sipping a smooth single malt scotch. Promiscuous, she would say, the way she drops one boy for the next, the way she dresses. I would admonish myself. Why tell her anything? I'd rant in my head. You stupid you. My friend wore short dresses with boots, left her legs bare, strong. I tried it once, but kept pulling my tights back on. I was no slut like Marion. She was probably sleeping with our English teacher, Mr. Hardy. Taught us Madame Bovary, had dimples. Yes, for sure, she was sleeping with him, with her good vocabulary and bare legs. Mr. Hardy used the word promiscuous when teaching the story of Emma's compulsive love for Rudolph. The cliff notes say she falls for him because of his stylish green coat and his title, and he desires her because she seems like an easy conquest. See? Promiscuity. Was Mr. Hardy Marion's Rudolph? I never had her over again after my mother's remark. I kept things secret, those bare-legged things. As I pinched my nipples to make them pop under my shirt, meticulously drew the black liner under my lids, as I rolled my tights off in the girls' bathroom before I slid into the seat of my 11th grade math class, I too would have a green-coated man, perhaps Mr. Bander. After all, I needed extra help in geometry, not in language or matters of the heart. I already knew then what I know now. In short, it's no mystery how sluts get to be sluts. It's all knot in your stomach, headlong obsession and remorse, sizzle and ghost.
What a moment. Thank you so much. As you're writing, do you recite these? Is that a part of the practice? And I mean, how does it keep you honest to recite something for yourself to better understand a piece like this?
Yeah, well, great question. Thank you. You have to read your poems out loud. And this is in my classes, I talk about you have to read them aloud. You have to for the sound. When you do, I always discover this slant rhyme or rhymes I didn't know that I had in the poems. A poem needs to be musical. That's what makes it poetry and not prose. The line breaks, the rhythms, all of these things, you want music. So sometimes I read them aloud as I'm writing them. Sometimes I wait a few drafts and then I read them aloud. But inevitably, changes will be made after you hear them read aloud. The other great thing, with all these phones we have now, they do everything but write the poems. Although you can get ones that do that now, so I hear. But you record and you listen to the recording.
Yeah.
And you will inevitably hear something wrong. I mean, as a playwright, you'll know if the dialogue isn't authentic.
Right.
You can hear that right away. So the same for poems. You see, the feelings have to be authentic. The imagery needs to be authentic. And sometimes when you hear it, the mistakes shoot out at you when they don't on the page or in a different way on the page.
Right.
So, yeah.
And I do feel like it's appropriate for especially in particular for a poem like Promiscuous, which might carry some potentially charged perspectives on what that actually is, because a lot of people have a wide range of opinions on that. I just think it's so unique to consider the importance of getting it right for yourself rather than getting sort of lost in other perspectives. A poem like this, was this, I hate to ask if this was like a personal experience or anything, because I know that there's little kernels of truth in everything, but
Yeah.
how do you get to the truth of that in this particular poem? What was the challenge in getting the tone right for Promiscuous?
Well, one thing I will say, just reading it to you right now, to your audience, this poem could be considered dated in a lot of ways because today, having bare legs and short skirts and all this, I mean, it's a whole new world now. And people wear and do what they want. I mean, this is from the 70s, the early 70s. And it's interesting because I wonder how people will see that. Like, when I was a senior in high school, you still were not allowed to wear skirts.
Oh, wow.
Girls had to wear pants to school. I mean, this is an interesting, it's almost like, historical fiction. This is historical poetry. and you could never, today, if a teacher even, pats you on the shoulder, you can have them arrested. When I went to high school, the teachers were sleeping with their students. I mean, it's just the way it was, it's very interesting. And I have to think about that because people, young girls, and I'm not answering your question. I will get to it. But,
no problem.
I'm thinking that a lot of young women will very much relate to this book because it's sort of a young girl coming of age book, which makes me happy because I definitely came of age, many years ago. But I wonder about that. But anyway, it was William Matthews' poem Promiscuity that inspired this one. And the thing in his poem, the line was, "How does a slut become a slut?" And it was a humorous poem, but there was a lot of seriousness in it. So that was my focus. How does a slut become a slut? And I immediately, because a lot of poetry, and I also teach this class, poetry and memory, all of our memories are there and they come up at odd when we're writing and doing automatic writing. So I did have a friend, and my mother didn't like her because she thought she was too, whatever.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And she wore very short skirts. And I did learn, don't ever tell your mother anything because it will come back to haunt you. So have some secrets, So these things just sort of bubbled up. And I did have a very cute teacher named Mr. Hardy who taught us Madame Bovary. And the fact that Mr. Hardy and Madame Bovary rhymed, these things are all working out for me in this poem.
Right.
Yeah, so the poem came together, but you asked at the beginning for a poem that was more difficult, that took a lot more time to resolve itself. This poem took a lot of time to resolve itself. And then I will say, my book is dedicated to Erica John, but I also dedicated to Stephen Dunn, who, Dunn, who is one of the great poets and a huge influence on me. And I would, toward the end of his life, I was really lucky that I could send some poems. I would send some poems to him, and he would make some comments. And he really liked promiscuity, but he did say to me, and now, of course, I just read you the poem and I can't find it. The last line about sizzle, and he didn't understand that. He said, "Why is that there?" And I thought, well, see, now that's an expression, ghosting someone, which maybe he didn't know.
Right.
And, sizzle and go, oh, here we go. It's all not in your stomach, headlong, obsession and remorse, sizzle and ghost. He didn't understand sizzle and ghost. Now, I'll tell you something. When someone you admire who is a genius is questioning something, for me not to have taken it out, I could have ended it with, it's all not in your stomach, headlong, obsession, remorse. I could have ended, and I had that ending for a long time, and I kept adding sizzle and ghost, taking it out, adding it. And I made the decision to keep it, even though he didn't really get why it was there. That for me was a leap.
That's great. That's great to hear, because in my thinking, that is the bridge, the generational bridge that I think we need to have for the older generational context moving into a newer kind of context. At least that's sort of what it seems like to me. Like, it lands because it's perennial. It's not just something that might have happened back there, but like those kinds of emotions or some of those feelings might be a part of today's conversation as well. But to your point, I do think that that's got to be a really powerful thing to say, oh, well, I'm just going to have to commit to this one. I'm going to have to go 100% regardless of what some people might say.
Yeah, that's the, see, poetry, there's so many choices one has to make. Of course, the subject matter, of course, the choice to write something about that, then the choice of the line breaks, the choice of the sounds, the choice after you listen to it, what do you take out? And then who do you show it to? And how is their opinion going to matter, and will it matter? And, it goes on and on and on. And so, yeah, it's quite an ordeal. It's quite an undertaking. Who knows why we do it? I don't know why.
Well, it's because we get these phenomenal collections that are so full of joy and expression, and of course perspective, which is what we want to get at. So I only got a couple more questions to be mindful of your time here, but first and foremost, this has been such a pleasure to get to listen to you share these poems and to celebrate What She Wants, which will be coming out real soon. If I may ask, I know we're kind of diverting here, but I did want to ask how your ability to work in different fields, because not only are you an educator and a poet, but you're also in public relations, which is, I imagine, a huge part of your life. And I'm sorry that I'm only asking you this one about it, but how do these kinds of disciplines that are very, business oriented or less sort of artistic. Well, I don't even want to say that because I think that, public relations, there's a lot that might overlap, but maybe I'll leave it to you to share with me. How does something like public relations overlap with the written word and your sense of self and discovering poetry in a much deeper, intimate way?
Yeah, of course. When you're a poet, you need another profession. Unless you're teaching, unless you go into academia and you teach, then you can survive. But that wasn't my route. I didn't want to go to university. I didn't want to teach. So anyway, yes, I started my own company. I do publicity for authors, for writers, not for poets. No poets. There's no money in it. I can't take your money. And I have to keep the boundaries, but I do have a company. I've had it for 40 years this spring.
Oh,
it's going to be 40
wonderful.
years.
Congrats.
Yeah, it's amazing. Thank you. Kim from LA, and I love it. And I do publicity for writers. Okay. So for a long time, I didn't write. I stopped writing poetry when I moved out here. I started the company. I would make little notes, but it wasn't serious. And I put all my energy into this company. And when my son left the house and went to college, you've heard this story 5 million times, it all came back to me. It was like, Thomas Luck said, you have nightingale fever, which is what the Russians used to call when the poems just kept pouring out. But I did. And it was amazing. And I went to a million workshops every Saturday morning for 12 years. I went to the Palm Beach Poetry Festival. I went to the Sarah Lawrence Summer. I got the craft back. It was magnificent. So what I learned was, at the beginning, I didn't talk to my clients about that I was a poet. None of them knew I was a poet or had been a poet because I had been in college. I taught creative writing at Emerson. I wanted to keep it separate. It's like in LA, the waiter or waitress saying, I really want to direct, and you're like, just give me my coffee. I don't really care that you want to direct. I'm hungry. So my clients want publicity. They don't care that I'm a poet, and they shouldn't. But then after like the third book, it's like, okay, this is real. I go on my own book tours. I do interviews. And what I learned was they help one another. I know all the things they want to know, they need to know. I know what it's like to do an interview. I know what it's like to not see your book in the store when you go for a signing. I know the pitfalls. So I started to just say, hey, I'm also a poet. And I really feel that one informs the other, because when I write, they're out of my head. And everything I have to do and all the things I have to remember, I have this time that it's only the poem and me. And when I'm doing their work, I don't have to think about my poetry. I really am there for them. And I know what they need and I know what they want. And I know what the disappointment is like when things don't work. And I know the thrill when they do. So I'm just, I'm the perfect PR person for them. But no, seriously, I've been there, and my work is even better, frankly.
So lastly, in terms of nourishing your creative life and, perhaps outside of your creative life, I try to ask folks how they sustain this sort of creative life and this output, because as we know, it's incredibly difficult, whether you're doing poetry, whether you're writing a novel or any other kind of artistic pursuit. I'm always curious how people create sustainability for themselves in a world that continually tells them to disregard the artistic perspective that they have within them. So are there some things that nourish you? It doesn't have to be even artistic. It can be anything in your life that benefits you mentally, emotionally, physically. What keeps you going?
Pretty much vodka, I think. No, that's a humorous answer to avoid the truth. Look, that's a toughie, because I could say a bunch of cliches, beauty. Look, anything that moves me emotionally is meat, ammunition, fuel for the fire. An overwhelming look. We all reach for a poem if someone we know dies, or gets married, or has a baby. We want to read a poem. We want to write a poem when we're moved emotionally. I mean, I'll go to the beach and a wave will crash, and it'll set me back somewhere to write something. So I think beauty and emotion and feeling, we want to feel. That's what it's all about. It's the feeling that gets you going. I'm having a lot of problem right now because with the world as it is and our recent election, I just feel like, what's the point? This is the most dangerous thing for me and a lot of other people I know. Who cares about this poem? Because we always say poems can change the world. Well, you know what? I'm not sure that's true. Maybe they can, but, so all these things come into my head. Who cares about this? This has nothing to do with the world. Does this make a difference? And I don't like those kinds of feelings. I want to go back to my old happy self, my old stupid happy self that thinks people care.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I really can't thank you enough for addressing that, because I feel like the last couple of conversations I've had with people, that's really been on the tip of my tongue the entire time. What is the worth of this right now? And how can we still find a way to celebrate what we have to share with each other in a way that is constructive? Does it even have to be constructive? How can we sort of like mend ourselves right now in a time that's very, precarious, it seems. So thank you for sharing it, because it's the truth. It's the truth. But for all of us who value poetry and the beauty of expression, I can't thank you enough for your time and for this work that's coming out into the world. Kim, I know we just scratched the surface, but it's been an absolute pleasure. And I want to congratulate you on the collection, because the readings were phenomenal. And I hope we get to catch up down the road.
I want to thank you. Really, this was an amazing interview. I really enjoyed it, and it made me feel worthy. It made me feel like I'm in the game here. Honestly, it was great. I didn't think about anything else. I didn't look at my email when it was coming in. I was in the moment,
in the zone. Well, I appreciate your time. Thank you again so much, Kim. But I hope to catch up on the internet, but I will be in touch shortly, okay? So you take care.
Beautiful.
And we'll talk real soon.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.